Welcome everyone to the 20th webinar in the Governing for Reform in Aged Care webinar series. Today's webinar is entitled Human Centricity in Aged Care, the Consumer, the Employee and the Organisation. My name is Nikki Doyle, KPMG Australia's National Sector Leader for Ageing, and it is my pleasure to be your host today. I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we are meeting upon today. Today, I am on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to country. We also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending from other areas of Australia. Today's webinar is about how you, your governing body and executive team can incorporate a human-centric approach to leadership within your organisation. So why are we focusing on this? Well, there's an increased focus on consumer centricity in the design and delivery of aged care services, and that has highlighted a positive association between consumer experience and improved clinical outcomes. Positive consumer experience has also been shown to be a good indicator of the quality of aged care. Leaders in aged care are challenged to balance this important focus on the consumer while also understanding that the people who work within the organisation are of crucial importance to the collective success of the organisation. In order to be genuinely human-centric, we must focus on the design and delivery of services with the consumer experience, the employee experience, and the goals of the organisation itself at the front of mind. Taking a human-centric approach to leadership can effectively build positive working relationships where employees feel confident and happy to express their individual wants and needs and empowered to do their best work. Clear communication of the organisation goals to employees and consumers alike will pave the path towards a successful future. Treating all people with respect, trust and appreciation is of crucial importance if we are to provide the best possible services to those that we care for. For today's webinar, I am delighted to be joined by Gillian Groom, Lisa Chung and Matt Mulvihill, all of whom I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk to, and I will introduce each of them more formally in a moment. Before we get started, I'm conscious that while many of you joining us today have been participating in the program for some time, others are new to the program and wondering what Governing for Reform in Aged Care is all about. If you are here for the first time, welcome to the program. As a registered program participant, if you head to the Governing for Reform in Aged Care website, you will have access to a range of Governing for Reform resources, and some of the resources that you might like to access that are directly linked to today's webinar include the online learning module called Module 1, which is called Consumers at the Centre of Care. Our most recent podcast episodes, which are The Voice of the Consumer by Danielle Hills, Judith Leeson and Val Fell, noting that each of these are also available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. The toolkit on consumer and stakeholder engagement, and the podcast titled The Aged Care Workforce Insights from an Aged Care CEO. You will also find recordings from all of our previous webinars and information about opportunities to get involved in other parts of the program. Before we start our panel conversation today, I would like to draw your attention to the layout of the screen. You will notice that you can manipulate the screen in any way you like. So if you would like to see the presenters in full screen, you can expand the various windows to suit your preference. We are also really keen to make this an engaging discussion. If you would like to submit a question for the panel, please do so in the question and answers box, which is on your screen. We will aim to select a few questions throughout the discussion for the panel members as time allows. So, as mentioned today, mentioned earlier, I had the absolute pleasure of hosting this panel discussion on the very important issue of human centricity in aged care, the consumer, the employee, and the organisation. Please join me in welcoming our three wonderful panellists for today. First of all, I would like to welcome Gillian Groom. So Gillian has been an occupational therapist for 50 years, but has more recently established a career in elder and succession law. She received her law degree from the University of Tasmania 3 weeks before turning 70, which is an amazing achievement. Gillian has lived and worked in Tasmania for most of her life. She has extensive experience in community engagement throughout her involvement with a wide range of groups, including those that represent people who are culturally culturally diverse, and also, as well as people living with a disability. Gillian has also served on many boards and committees at state and national levels. As a parent of 6 adult children and 17 young grandchildren, she is particularly passionate about the future of ageing in Australia. Gillian, welcome greatly to our webinar, and I'm very much looking forward to your perspectives today. Our second guest is Lisa Chung, and Lisa serves as a non-executive director on boards of various commercial and not-for-profit organisations, spanning a wide range of sectors. She is currently the chair of Australian Unity and the Front Project, as well as being a non-executive director of AB Jennings, Artspace, the Committee for Sydney, and Warren and Mahoney Architects. She is also a trustee of the Art Gallery of New South Wales Foundation. In her earlier career, Lisa was a partner at law firms Maddox and Blake Dawson, now Ashurst. She is a graduate of the University of Tasmania and in 2004 completed the Advanced Management Program at INSEAD in France. In 2020, Lisa became a member of the General Division of the Order of Australia for significant service to the community through charitable and cultural organisations. Lisa, welcome to our panel. And last but certainly not least, I'm delighted to be joined by Matt Mulvihill. Matt is the Head of People and Culture for ECH in South Australia and has a master's degree in leadership from Griffith University. Prior to his current role at ECH, Matt undertook a range of people and culture leadership and specialist roles across the South Australian public sector. Across a 20-year career in the public and community sectors, Matt has led and delivered programs and activities aimed at driving and improving culture and employee experience, workforce and leadership capability, workforce planning and organisational design. Matt brings a unique perspective on what it takes to find, engage and retain a workforce in an increasingly complex and competitive environment. Welcome, Matt. We are very much looking forward to your insights today. So, to start off our webinar, what I'd like to do is start with a question to explore what we actually mean by the term human centricity. And so what I'd like to understand from each of the panel members, and Lisa, I'll come to you first. What does the term human centricity mean to you? And why is it actually important to embed that within leadership in aged care? Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this important panel. Well, when we're talking about aged care services, obviously it is a subsector of what are sometimes referred to as human services, and that's an important aspect. It's really simple. It's about putting people first. It's about connecting with and focusing on the people who are at the heart of our services, who are our clients, our employees, and the communities around them, their families, etc. And on top of that, I think it's understanding the interdependencies and the positive associations of each of those cohorts and how they might engage with each other. So one group influences the next, and they're inextricably linked, as you can imagine. I know we'll talk about employee satisfaction and the importance of that on the delivery of quality of services later, but that's a good example of it. And so I think it's really about putting people at the centre of the services that you're delivering, and I think it's a sort of fairly It's a simple concept, but sometimes difficult to maintain in a consistent way.
Fantastic. I think we're going to circle back and talk about why there are some challenges around that in a little while. Fantastic. Gillian, interested in your perspective.
Thank you, Nikki. It's a delight to be able to take part in such a forum. I'm coming towards the second year of my tenure in the Council of Elders, and I have to say that I feel the placing of the human at the centre has always happened, but not always the aged person. I feel they have been the last of the line to be considered. Now, this is changing dramatically, and it's absolutely essential that people on boards now understand. I'd even go so far as to say that some boards, and I have observed this, have probably put themselves at the centre of the aged care scene. And there are reasons for that. I understand they have to answer, sometimes if it's commercial, the operation, they have to answer to shareholders. This can no longer be even remotely the case. It must now be the aged person and their surrounding, I think, Nikki, you mentioned the wider circle. That's very, very important. And also, of course, the staff, because happy staff, happy residents. So there's a shift. There is a shift, and I think I think the journey for the aged person is probably a longer one to get to the centre than the other parties involved. Now, you probably say I'm biased, and maybe I am, but I have seen over this period of listening to the community and their needs and wants and having conversations with aged people and often their families, they have felt definitely not at the centre. They are a product, a number, something that has to be dealt with. This is not human centricity in terms of aged care. I think
fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Gillian. I am looking forward to coming back and delving into what you've just said as we go through the webinar. Matt, turning to you, and you're obviously bringing a very much an employee perspective. Can you talk to me a little bit about what does human centricity mean to you and your perspective about why it's so important to embed it, particularly from an employee perspective?
Sure. And some great points there from Lisa and Gillian that I'll try not to double up on too much, and looking forward to the opportunity to come back to that connection between customer and employee, because I think that's a really strong theme here. But for me, human centricity is really, as from the employee lens, is really about designing the system our people operate within to adapt to them rather than forcing our people to adapt to the system. Because when we adapt a system or a process or a structure to the people who use it, we elicit their commitment. And when we force people to adapt to a system, process or structure, we compel their compliance. And so adapting systems to people considers their needs and offers them choice, and forcing them to adapt, I guess, forces them to comply. And to take that a little further, when people are operating out of compliance, they will give you, in theory, everything you ask for and precisely nothing you didn't. However, when they're operating out of commitment, you unlock the discretionary effort, which drives all of those wonderful things like productivity and innovation and collaboration and retention. And just to illustrate that point, I think I'd ask people to think about a time when you did something that you were compelled to do, and then a time that you did something that you were committed to, and consider under which scenario you were more productive. So I guess my premise is that human centricity in a workforce context is about eliciting commitment from our people in order to unlock the qualities in them that we need to run really effective organisations.
Fantastic. What a great introduction. And thank you for each of you for your different perspectives. So really wanting to try and to dive into that a little bit more, and noting that we've got a range of different viewpoints around the table and perspectives. I think one of the things that we see is that there is a real challenge in terms of balancing what we've just heard in terms of an organisational perspective and the need, as Gillian articulated, for an organisation to be sustainable, at the same time as actually being able to put older people at the centre of care and older Australians and their families at the centre of care, as well as Matt has talked about in terms of the employees. So I'm keen to just unpack that a little bit more. And Lisa, given your role, I'd be really keen for you to start in terms of how do you actually balance all of that from a leadership perspective, from a strategic perspective? How do you balance the consumer experience, the employee experience, but likewise also keep your eye on the goals of the organisation and ensure that you are sustainable? It sounds really tricky.
Well, it is and it isn't really, Nikki. I think I can only speak from the organisation that I chair, which is Australian Unity, and really
I think we might have just lost Lisa. Just while we're sorting out whether we've lost Lisa and whether we can get her back and get her answer, we might just pivot slightly, but I'll just adjust the questions slightly because obviously Gillian and Matt, you've both got different perspectives. But Gillian, I'm interested in your thoughts, and we might try and see, in terms of all of your experience that you've had, particularly around Council of Elders, and you talked about the privilege you've had of talking to many, many different older Australians and their family members. Have you got any examples about where this has been done well?
Yes, in fact, I had an experience recently. First of all, I'll just make a couple of other comments. The biggest block to doing this well is probably the age-old prejudice that surrounds, well, ageism, if you like, that, you turn 65, put you in that pigeonhole, you've done your stuff, go away, we'll tell you what you need, and you'll be grateful. Well, doesn't cut it anymore. So that attitude of pigeonholing and saying, we'll tell you, don't worry about it, it's not your business. Nothing could be further from the truth. And this is what people tell me all the time. The other thing is capacity. There's a presumption, meant to be, of capacity. But in fact, I think most of you would agree that it's the exact opposite. And once for instance, any sort of dementia diagnosis is made, that's the end of it. Now, my experience is absolutely the polar opposite. And the example I was going to give you, I went to the northeast coast of Tasmania, a beautiful place called the Fingal Valley, last week. And the reason I went with health department people, was because there was a Christmas lunch celebration, and it involved a large group, probably 30 or so, of older people in that community. It was the most revealing, it was just stunning what these people, their stories, their attitudes to their situation and how they were coping, the help they were getting. There were deficits, definitely. There were gaps. And in fact, one of the local aged care providers had just closed down that very week, and that was causing ripple effects. But, if you get the community together and actually listen to them, the people that are in this space, you will get ideas, you will provide support just from being in the group. And I think we need to do a lot more of this group. I would love to see hubs wherever possible, where there are meals, there are games, there are you can have your feet, the podiatrist will call in, maybe the geriatrician might come once a month. You can get your hair done, your hands done, your ears, hearing tested, this sort of thing, so that it doesn't have to be unattainable and disparate. I hope I'm making sense, but I really feel very, very strongly that bringing people together and sharing and listening is a very, very not only effective, but it will save the country an enormous amount of money. So that's what I'd be talking about in terms of how this can be done well. Listen to people. Don't think because they're old they can't talk. And this is what I meant by the longer journey. The customer, I think was the term Matt used, is a long way behind in this centricity issue. And yet they have the capacity most of the time to make a contribution.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gillian. Matt, I might come to you, and I just picking up a little bit about how Gillian answered that question. What I might do, I'd be really interested about understanding about how you actually balance that tri-focus in terms of organisational sustainability, but employee engagement, as well as engagement with older Australians. Why is it so hard? What's some of the challenge there? And then where have you seen that done well?
Yeah, so it is challenging, but there's some real logical connections that I think are worth pointing out. And so there's different ways you can stack up all of those and explain those different connections. But I think the logical order for me, at least, is that the goals of the organisation need to heavily feature customers and employees. Take into consideration that critical relationship which Gillian's touched on around between the customer and the employee, and the customer and employee experience. And my first key point, I guess, would be that the underpinning elements of customer experience and employee experience are remarkably similar. So for us, that's things like make it easy for me, understand me, show me I matter, empower me and help me grow. That they apply equally to a customer experience and an employee experience, because they're both about human experience. So that's a really important connection. And the other key point I'd make is that it's really critical to understand that CX, customer experience, sorry, I shouldn't speak in those terms. Customer experience is a product of employee experience. You can't have a great customer experience if you haven't got a great employee experience. So that's a really important connection. And that's where the leadership element comes into it, I think, because it's leaders who need to drive employee experience. And more specifically, bringing it back to the topic at hand, it means we need to have human-centric leaders who trust and support people, who empower and understand people, who listen to people and act on what they hear and recognise and value their contribution. So I think there's some logical connections there and a clear way to build it. In terms of an example, I might just be so bold as to use an example from my own organisation, if that's okay, because I think it's illustrative.
That's perfectly fine.
So at ECH, thank you. We've done a number of things, and one of the things we've actually done is partnering with KPMG to design our employee experience strategy and customer experience strategy, which is a very worthwhile investment. But another thing that we've done alongside that is that we're now into our third year of what we call our growth culture program. So this is, again, that employee focus. It's a program which focuses on building the skills which enable a more human-centric way of operating. So it's things like teaching people how to listen effectively, how to bring a growth mindset, how to understand other people's perspectives. So you can see how these things work between employees and also between employees and clients. And then one of the other key elements of the program is the development of psychological safety within the organisation, which we define across 4 levels, which is that our people, firstly, they feel included, then they feel safe to ask questions, then they feel safe to contribute, then they feel safe to challenge. So it's a learning program which isn't about building their technical skill, and neither is it a traditional leadership program. It's really a set of skills about how we work together and how we work with our customers, and it applies equally to leaders of the organisation through to people on the front line.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matt. I like that. And I can already see that there's a really common theme already that's come across from what you and Gillian have said about listening and about that ability to listen and listen effectively. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Lisa, welcome back. That was a very inopportune time for things to drop out, but I'm keen to come back to you with a question. As the chair of a board of an aged care provider, how do you balance leadership with consumer experience, with employee experience, whilst maintaining sustainability as an organisation? And I guess interested in why it sometimes doesn't work, but likewise, any examples that you might have and that you're happy to share about when it's worked really well.
I don't know how far I got into answering the question before I got cut off, but I think it's important to
Not
start
very.
with. I think it's important for me to start with who we are as an organisation, because I think that can make an enormous amount of difference. Where your sense of purpose is. So we're a mutual. We're formed by members of a community to support each other more than 180 years ago. Our ambition, our focus is on being Australia's most trusted wellbeing company, and we've been tracking the wellbeing of Australians in partnership with Deakin University for more than 20 years. And we're here to create positive community and social value for all Australians. So we do not report to shareholders. We are accountable to our members. So that's an important distinction, I think, when from a board perspective, you understand what the workings and what the DNA of the organisation in fact is. So in that context, embedding a human-centric approach from the board perspective has to run right through your organisation. Unless you're sort of genuine and authentic about it and think about it at that level, at board level, you've got to keep it front of mind. And I think when your organisation is formed and has operated as we have for all of that time, you know, it's not something that that is a sort of divergent path. It's embedded in who we are. So that's the important thing. I think I don't know if that's enough to answer your question, Nikki. I could sort of talk about other aspects of how that translates down to our clients, our residents, our employees. But it does require, over time it has required a big shift. But now we sort of feel that the progress that we've made around this, and I feel certainly 100% comfortable at board level about what our focus is and how we go about things.
Fantastic. Lisa, can I just pick up on something that you've said that I'm just keen to explore a little bit more, if you're comfortable, is around that shift. You just said that it's required a big shift. Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm conscious that picks up a little bit on what Gillian was saying in her opening remarks, and just interested in terms of what you can share around that and what you may have done as an organisation.
So, to be perfectly frank, the human-centric aspect of what we do and how we've always done it has always been there because of the origins of our organisation and our sense of purpose, etc. Where it can be quite challenging, and we've just come through quite a period of bad news stories, a royal commission, and a layer of regulation, or several layers of regulation, that are intended to address some of these issues. Now, so to actually connect the two up and to be responding to the regulatory regime and to ensure that a lot of the rules that you have to follow, the regulations that are put in place, are actually complied with. There's many of those are not per se themselves human-centric. So we've come through this big period of change around regulation, etc. So it has required a strong focus on ensuring that our processes, etc., are right up to date. And from a board perspective, managing compliance and risk at that level is important. So in order to get that right, sometimes you have to shift your efforts to make sure that you are in that space and doing the right things there. But the overriding point is that all of that is there to ensure that we are looking after our clients, our residents, and our people in the best way possible. So we always try and keep our eye on that ball. But I think we are making good progress around that, and that's certainly the pathway that we're taking.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisa, for those insights. I want to come back to the comment that Matt made, but likewise, I think one of the themes that came through in what Gillian has said about listening effectively. So, Matt, I want to come to you first. And what are some of the ways that you might keep your finger on the pulse, so to speak, to be able to really listen effectively to employees? But likewise, what's that link, and how do you then take that into listening to customers from your perspective?
Sure. So, I mean, firstly, I think it's probably important to say here that the challenge that you're asking about is quite different in different organisations. Different organisations have different challenges in terms of their size and the geographical spread and the number of employees and number of customers, and how their customers are able to and willing to communicate and engage. So it needs to be horses for courses, and I'll start with the obvious, and then I'll move into something that hopefully is a little bit more insightful, because I mean the obvious is we generally tend to start with our surveys and having really effective survey functionality within an organisation for staff and for clients. And at ECH, we use a particular tool which is actually designed to run those surveys both for customers and employees, and then it allows us to cross-reference the data that we gather from those two types of the various surveys we run across both. So that's very valuable. But in terms of those surveys, you can do your standard annual engagement surveys, you can do regular pulse surveys, you can do both. You can hone in on specific drivers like leadership effectiveness, wellbeing, diversity and inclusion, which are all really valuable. But I think the other thing you can do is you can plug into the key elements of the employee or the customer life cycle. And that's a part of the work we've done with KPMG to map out our customer and employee life cycles. And that's given us the opportunity to build a listening program which actually checks in at and about those key points in the life cycle to gather data and then build improvement right back into the point in the life cycle where we extracted the data from. So it's a much more accurate way of gathering information and then continuously improving. And it's not something you'd probably want to do alone. It needs to be combined with a broader package, but it gives you that very granular data that allows you to be targeted in the way that you act.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. There's a lot in there, a lot of different things to potentially consider and to think about. Gillian, following that up, you touched a little bit about, listening effectively, and I guess wanted to know whether you had any other suggestions about how can organisations embed that within how they operate, so that it's not a single point in time, but likewise they're getting a range of information from their older Australians that they're servicing, but also potential older Australians that they might be able to service, so they can think about how they embed human centricity in terms of their service design.
That's probably the central question of this webinar.
Yes.
I feel. We're all bringing our own perspectives, and they're all good ones, but it's how to actually bring this about. I think I mentioned prejudice and ageism, and I think my comments now are related to that. We need to demystify and make it more mainstream. Everyone celebrates when babies are born. This is wonderful, this is new life. And there's a lot of flowers and balloons and hoo-ha and carry on. But at the other end, it's not... What I'm saying is we must make the ageing process more fun, more mainstream, more... I don't know, the words are difficult to find. But bringing young people in to listen to the older people, and a few of the television programs, I'm sure you've seen some of these, have shown what an amazing effect it can have when even troubled teenagers are forming relationships with an older person who possibly has, in a sense, dropped the ball because they haven't had the stimulation and the opportunity to be listened to. So making ageing more of just mainstream life is part of the way I think you, in your various organisations, and Nikki brings the perspective of well-being, and Matt brings the perspective of getting the culture ingrained through commitment. It's a combination of all these things, but the prejudices and the aura around ageing needs to be broken down. There are many ways we can do this, but that's what I feel is the best approach. It's an inevitable part of the life cycle to get old. You don't choose to get old, it just happens. And it can be a wonderful journey. And if we can all accept that, and therefore the people, the staff working in, whether it's in-home care or in residential care or just community activities, because there'll be more and more of this happening. Everything is going to come back into the community, into the home. There won't be the same number of institutions, and we just need to generalise and make it normal part of the life cycle.
No, fantastic, Gillian. I like the idea of normalisation, but likewise, I also like the idea of celebration. I think there is something to be said about being able to celebrate as people age, and not just around significant birthdays, which finish with a 0. Lisa, I want to come back to something that you said. You mentioned when you were responding last time about something that you use in terms of the Wellbeing Index. And I'm conscious that whilst there might be some people who are listening to the webinar that may be aware around that there are probably many, many others that aren't. And I think it would be great if you were able to expand just a little bit around that. And what are some of the valuable insights that gives you over that 20-year period that you mentioned that you've been implementing and using that within Australian Unity? Because I think that's a great example in terms of focusing on human centricity.
Well, it is. It's much broader than in relation to our services for older people, but it is academically sound. It's been running for 20 years. We have 20 years of data. It's implemented by the academics at Deakin University, and it is often broadly reported in the press about what we're seeing in trends of how people are, rates of mental illness, etc. And the latest version that came out within the last couple of months shows that our well-being is actually diminished to an unacceptably low level, I would say, at the moment. So it does provide that sort of trend, that platform for all of those who are tracking, not just ourselves, but Australia-wide, those who are tracking well-being, and what it means for what they're doing, mental health providers, etc. So it's a copy of it's freely available on our website. So I would encourage people to have a look at that, because that sort of longitudinal data is actually very valuable for many things that you do.
Fantastic. And Lisa, is that something as the chair of a board that you do look at and consider in terms of your decision making?
Well, it does inform us, of course, because it's the fundamental data set for the company that wants to be the most trusted wellbeing company in Australia. So it's absolutely the bedrock of that, and it tracks how successful as a nation we are and where we need to focus. It informs us on our services. It informs us on where we're able to advocate for change. So it is absolutely the bedrock, just as our social impact report is on delivering community and social value.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lisa. So a tool that is used that reports up the board, as well as many, many others in your organisation, really consider and think very carefully about how you can use that information to help drive you as an organisation to be, as you say, the best wellbeing organisation in Australia. There is an audience question which is around the name of the research that Lisa referred to. So Lisa, can you just share that again in terms of the research and where you can find it?
Yeah.
I know it's on your website.
Yeah, it's called the Wellbeing Index, and it's the Australian Unity Wellbeing Index, and it's it should be on our website easily. Just type that into the search box, and you should be able to get it.
Fantastic. And you're partnering with Deakin University.
Deakin University, yeah.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you. I've also got another audience question. So one of the things, Matt, I'm going to come to you about this. The question is very topical, is how do we prioritise, particularly the employee value proposition when we're in a resource-constrained environment? So interested in your perspectives.
Yeah, that's a big question, and I think it goes to the general challenges of living a human-centric way as a busy, under-resourced, time-pressured leadership team, whether that be a board, whether that be an executive, whether that be at the next tier down. And I think it certainly requires really conscious effort, and I think there are some barriers. I think that empathy is a key underlying element of human centricity and that employee value proposition that you're trying to build in an organisation. And sometimes I think empathy can evaporate a little bit under pressure. I don't think we should be assuming that as leadership groups we are all bringing our most empathetic version of ourselves to every situation. I think we need to actually be conscious of bringing that as an executive and/or bringing that a certain sort of personality strength onto your decision to the decision-making table. I also think that we constantly face a lure of expedience to make the most expedient decision, and I think sometimes the human-centric decision and the decision that is going to really drive our value proposition is not necessarily the quickest, not necessarily the cheapest, and might even present some risk. And so, and you can't always make that. Sometimes you do have to choose expedience. Of course, it's always about balance. It's just probably about, to some degree, holding ourselves accountable to hold up a beacon of the value proposition when we are making decisions day to day. Because I think our rhetoric's often right, our strategic documents are often have the language right, but it's just the day-to-day decision-making where we have to make a really conscious effort to be thinking about what are the choices we have here, which is the human-centric choice, which is the expedient choice, if they are not the same one, and just seeking balance to try and really elevate that employee value proposition.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matt, so much for those insights. Lisa, I've got another audience question, and I was really interested in your perspective, and which is, the audience question is, what is the role of organisations to normalise ageing, and what are some of the options to begin to embed that into the communities? And Gillian, I will come to you after that as well to get your perspective.
Look, I think we all have a role to play in that. So the issues and the perspectives that Gillian was talking about. So before I was the chair of Australian Unity, I chaired the Benevolent Society, which had a very detailed campaign, and I think it's still running, around normalising and doing all of those things that Gillian said. But I think it is actually incumbent on all of us, not just organisations, all of us as individuals. We live in such a youth-oriented culture in this country. It's such a thing to overcome, and so all of us, we probably don't go through life in a single day without talking about the care that we're giving to somebody older, or that the person we're talking to is doing. So it is absolutely present, and yet we culturally still have this very youth-oriented culture. So I completely agree with Gillian, but I don't really have the answers to how we overcome that, other than to keep talking about it, and to keep talking about it in positive terms. And I think the power of the visual and the storytelling is critically important as well. So Gillian referenced these television programs, Old People's Home for 4-year-olds, and the more recent one with some troubled teenagers. And I think those sorts of things are very powerful for getting the message across. I think there are different cultures within our population who probably do elder care a bit better than others. And I come from a Chinese background, so that is obviously somewhat different to some other cultures. So we can learn a lot from those, and I think it's hugely rewarding, as we've seen in those stories told in those programs.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. Gillian, interested in your perspectives, noting Lisa's very pertinent comments that, I think it is challenging, but likewise, it's a role for everyone. So, Gillian, interested in your thoughts.
Yes, it is challenging, Lisa, and you touched on the cultural differences, and there's no doubt we're learning a lot through migration into this country and the multicultural society that we now have, and we should pick the eyes out of all those good things. If you like, Anglo-Saxon tradition, since the breakdown of the extended family and the move towards nuclear families, it hasn't helped. So that's the negative side. Let's look at the positive. If we put lots of older people together in situations where they feel able and free to express themselves, we haven't done this well. And that's the community activity thing is what I'm pushing all the time. Really, if you keep people active and engaged, the health bill goes down. It's not rocket science to understand that. And so getting groups constantly to do various activities and listening to them as they're doing it and letting them design their own activities is the way to go. We can't do this everywhere, but we can do it if we have that focus far more than we are.
Vicky, can I just make a comment about that, if that's all right? I think the co-design and the empowerment for older people to be engaged in, rather than sort of say, oh, well, this activity's on, would you like to join it? But to actually be proactively engaged in co-design and to empower them, to give them back that sort of sense of, well, rather than shifting the rhetoric from what's wrong with you to what matters most to you is so critically important. So one of the things that we have just been implementing is a thing called the health plan tool. And that is a planning tool for our residents and for our clients that delivers a sort of systematic way of ensuring that they're supported through proactive conversations about what they want. And it's interactive, it's engaging, it's bespoke for them. And it's a way of, it's a means of promoting those sorts of things that we're talking about. It's, we are talking about human-centric approach, but sometimes you do need these tools to actually promote and facilitate some better engagement around it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. I think that really brings to life, what Gillian was talking about. I'm conscious we are reaching towards the end of the time, and I'm about to ask, I think, what our last question is, and conscious that I think there'll be some great tips in here. But I'm interested from the three of you about what your three top tips are for embedding a human-centred approach in terms of leadership in aged care. And Matt, I might start with you and then come to Gillian and then to finish up with Lisa. So Matt, over to you.
Great, thank you. So I'll touch on some things I've already covered, but just to summarise, I think it's important. So number one, wherever you can, look to adapt the systems and processes and structures to the people who use them to elicit their commitment, remembering that that commitment requires choice freely given by those employees. So it's giving them choice and freedom and trust as much as we possibly can. The second thing is, I think that there's a whole new category of skills out there which aren't technical and aren't traditional leadership, which are about how we work together and how we work with our customers. And that's things like building psychological safety, growth mindset, building adaptability, building the skills of collaboration. We need to build those skills in our organisation and our people. If, as we were speaking about in the last question, if we are going to have people out there who are empowering the people they're working with, they need to be empowered themselves. And I think no leader or team can make the human-centric decision every time, because the human-centric decisions sometimes are more complex, more time-consuming, or more costly, or maybe even more risky. But I think it's worthwhile for us, when we're making decisions, to call out which are the human-centric options and which aren't, and hold ourselves to account, to give ourselves the best chance of achieving the balance so we can create that shift we're looking for. So they're my three things.
Fantastic. Matt, I particularly like the last one. I think that touches on the question that was from the audience in terms of that resource constraint, that helps us to actually really, even when there is a resource constraint, to take that step forward and to be accountable and to really be deliberate about sometimes the decisions that have to be made. So thank you. I think that's some amazing 3 tips. Gillian, over to you. Was keen for what are your 3 tips that you have for our listeners today in terms of embedding a human-centric approach to leadership in aged care?
So, number 1, connection. Allow the customers that you are dealing with to all manner of different connections, but loneliness is a massive problem for older people, and it shouldn't be. So promoting connection in whatever aspect of aged care you're involved in is many, many ways of doing that. So, but recognising that human connection is so, so important. The other one, of course, is that we hear a lot about is staying active and exercise. If there's a lintel over the door of aged care, it should be exercise. And this can be done at any level. It can be done in chairs. It can be done just with one limb. It can be done in water. Exercise is absolutely critical. And I think I could not finish my presentation today without mentioning dignity of risk. Now, I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about. If not, I will explain it further. But it relates to ageism, I suppose, and people having decisions made for them. It is possible to make decisions and take a risk and enhance a life if this concept is recognised. Do people understand what I'm talking about? It enhances the aging process if people are able to make choices to take occasionally a risk. And it relates not only to physical environment, it relates to stimulation of all sorts, living choices where you live. It's a very important part of being older. They're my 3 things.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gillian, for those insights. Lisa, over to you for your 3 insights and 3 things you would like to leave the audience thinking about from today.
Yes, but so strongly endorse what Gillian just said about the dignity of risk. But the 3 things I would say are putting people first and role modelling human centricity. So that's critically important. The second is really about promoting an experimentation mindset and culture. And to some extent that goes to Gillian's point about the dignity of risk. This applies to both our residents and our clients as well as our people. And having an org chart that is not too hierarchical, that it has a flatter structure that facilitates that fluidity, I guess. And the third is really about making sure that you have a proper dialogue, a culture of honest and open feedback, and the loop of actually acting upon feedback and continuous improvement as a result of that. So those would be my three.
Fantastic. So once again, great insights. I think we've managed to have 9 fantastic tips for everyone listening today. Thank you so much for joining us today. That brings us to the end of our webinar. I would like to say a very, very, very big thank you to Gillian, Lisa and Matt. 3 very different perspectives, but 3 very insightful perspectives. And hopefully our listeners today can take away 1 or 2 things that will really help to drive human centricity within each of your organisations. From my perspective, some of the things that I've taken away is around, I think, and it's come through in each of our 3 guests, is around listening effectively and some of the different ways of doing that. And in particular, I liked Lisa's comments towards the end about tools being able to enable us to listen, but not being a hindrance, but rather being a way to help us to be able to listen. I think Gillian had a range of different ideas in terms of having that dialogue, and agree completely in terms of dignity of risk. I think at the centre of human centricity design. And Matt, certainly from you, I think that connection, and we talked about it up front, and we didn't probably get enough time to properly explore that, but that connection between customer experience and employee experience, and how being human-centric from an employee perspective also drives being human-centric from a customer or older person perspective. And I think that's an incredibly important thing for us to all consider, and to think through how we actually manage and implement that within our organisation, and understanding that being employee-centric helps us to achieve being customer-centric or older person-centric. Last but certainly not least, and we once again, this was touched upon by I think each of you, was around compliance and where compliance sits. But likewise, really being able to turn that around to actually drive then your customer centricity, and making sure that you're actually that compliance is not everything. And I think, Matt, you summed that up really well at the beginning. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. Directly following today's event, we will be sending you an email with a link to provide feedback. Please take the time to do this, as it is really valuable for us to hear from you. We are adjusting the experience as we progress through the webinar events, and your feedback is crucial to us being able to do so. As mentioned earlier, please access some of the related learning activities shared in the reminder email for this event. And some of those activities include the online learning module for called Consumers at the Centre of Care, which is core module 1. Our Voice of Consumer podcast episodes, and that is both on our platform but also on our podcast streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. In particular, a lot of what Gillian has talked about, we identify and delve into within those podcast episodes. So I'd highly recommend you to go and have a look at those. The toolkit chapters on consumer and stakeholder engagements, which have some very practical examples that hopefully our listeners can use to actually think about how this might apply to them, and be able to have some practical ideas around implementing human centricity. And last but not least, we've also got a podcast episode focusing on the aged care workforce. So as a reminder, we have from the 1st of January 2024, the Governing for Reform in Aged Care program will move to its next phase, and will be available to anyone working within the aged care sector who is interested in strengthening their governance and leadership skills. So for further information, please visit the Governing for Reform in Aged Care website, and keep an eye out for the 2024 webinar series. So thank you very, very much for joining us today, and for those of you that have joined more than one webinar, for joining us for the webinar series this year for Governing for Reform. I hope everyone has a time to potentially have some downtime over Christmas, and we are looking forward to a 2024 webinar series continuing for Governing for Reform. Thank you very much, everyone.